The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke. As Jesus continued his journey to Jerusalem, he traveled through Samaria and Galilee, and as he was entering a village, 10 lepers came to meet him. They stood at a distance from him and raised their voices, saying, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." And when he saw them, he said, "Go show yourselves to the priests." As they were going, they were cleansed, and one of them, realizing he had been healed, returned glorifying God in a loud voice, and he fell at the feet of Jesus and thanked him. He was a Samaritan. And Jesus said in reply, "Were not all 10 made whole? Where are the other 9? Has none but this foreigner returned to give thanks to God?" And then he said to him, "Stand up, go your way, your faith has saved you." The Gospel of the Lord. What a great selection of readings again this weekend. As often happens, we can hear the words and we think, "Oh yeah, I know that one, I remember that." And that it was merely a story about lepers that received healing, the first reading and the gospel. But we know, right, that it's much more than that. Jesus doesn't leave it there, but he desires to instruct and teach us through that whole experience. So what do you think, listening to those 2 readings? What do you think he might be trying to teach us? Consider the source. Okay? It's a valuable thought. Thankfulness. Faith. But let's look more closely at them because there are powerful ingredients here. We have the first reading, the story of Naaman the Syrian. Naaman was a general in the Armenian army, the Syrian we call them today. And he was a pretty important individual and was pretty proud of his own importance. But he heard through his wife's servant, a slave, possibly one that was captured when they invaded Israel, and it was not uncommon for them to take servants for their own value. But she is living in the household of Naaman, and she says to his wife, and then she tells Naaman, "There's a prophet in Israel that can help you." He had contracted the dreaded disease of the day, leprosy. Can you imagine? Leprosy. It's something akin to cancer in our own society, except that the external manifestations are not readily visible. For people with leprosy, the scars showed, and the blotches and everything else. And it caused terror and anxiety. So Naaman gets this word. You could go to Israel and see the prophet. But he thinks, why would I go to Israel? Israel is a little pathetic. Why should I go there to be healed? Why couldn't I be healed here? But because of the insistence of his wife and some of his friends and the king, he said, well, hey, go and try it. Go and see the prophet. And so he reluctantly goes, and he travels and finds the hut or the cave of the prophet Elisha. sends word that he's outside. I am the great general of the Syrian army. I am here seeking the healing that I hear you can provide for me. And Elisha sends out a messenger and says, tell him go bathe 7 times in the Jordan River. His response? Indignation. You've got to be kidding me. What makes the waters of the Jordan so much better than our rivers in Damascus and throughout Syria? We have great waters there. What's so special about bathing in the Jordan? But that wasn't the core issue. The core issue was deeper than that. Whether it was the Jordan River or the rivers in Damascus, it was an issue of faith. And so he said, we're going home, but his entourage persuade him. You know, he had a touch of the red, you know? You ever had that experience? You know, a touch of the red ass. That's what he had, you know? Really. And he was absolutely resistant. Stubborn and refused to go. But his entourage said, hey, look, listen carefully. It won't do you any harm. And there's a real possibility it might do you some good. And so he goes. He bathes, and we pick up the reading there. He plunged 7 times into the Jordan River, and voila! Man, was he surprised. His flesh became again like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean of his leprosy. Pretty powerful conversion. He comes back, seeks out the prophet. He says, now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. And then he offers a gift to the prophet. The prophet duly refuses the gift, saying, I don't accept gifts for proclaiming the kingdom. I'm merely giving what has been given to me, freely given, freely provided to others. And now we begin to see the larger picture. The story of the 10 who were cleansed. The 10 lepers, we know the story well. It's provided only in the Gospel of Luke. It's not in Matthew or Mark. And it may be not too surprising, because Luke, being a physician, had a great interest in the healing ministry of Jesus. We see it throughout this journey to Jerusalem. But what an interesting experience. Leprosy was a terrible disease in those days. It was very prevalent, and there were very stringent laws in place in order to prevent the movement or the spread of the disease. They had very strict and rigid laws. And there were great restrictions on people who had the disease. Very controlled. They had to, as they entered into the public domain, they had to announce their presence. They were supposed to ring a bell and say, unclean, unclean, lepers coming in among you, the people. How humiliating. Struggling already with that disease, and to be so outcast. And the obvious questions are, how in the world did they ever get to know about Jesus? They were cast into colonies. Who was proclaiming the good news? How did they hear about the possibility of him being the healer, the divine physician, the one who could take care of all things? I wonder, would it have been the Samaritan? Wouldn't that be a cool thing? The Samaritan, the one preaching the good news to the other 9. Let's go to him. A Jew. A Jew? You know about Jews and Samaritans. They despised each other. They were the enemy. a Jew? Maybe it was just a last-ditch effort to really try and find some relief in their intense struggle. But nonetheless, they appear before him. Master, have pity on us. You know our struggle. And Jesus' response, rather amazing. Go show yourselves to the priests. Why? Why did he say that? Well, it's pretty simple. The people responsible for certifying a cure were the priests or the Sanhedrin. The government had passed the responsibility to them because they were the premier religious body, and it was important to have a process in place. Because some people could claim healing when many of their scars were gone, and coming into the public domain caused a real threat. So somebody had to certify there was a healing and that it was genuine. And those were the priests. Jesus was merely observing the law, and they knew that law very well, and they were following, and on their way they are healed. And the dramatic parts of the story, one comes back. Which one? A Samaritan. It's an old story throughout the gospel. We see it constantly in Jesus' teaching. The one least likely to come back is coming back and giving thanks. All of the others who knew it all and understood the scriptures and understood the promise of the Messiah and everything else, no. And so he comes back and he throws himself at the feet of Jesus. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I can't tell you what it means. It's a very powerful experience, and it leads us to the real core teaching. Core teaching is best summarized in this. You familiar? You like it? And the rest of you? You like it too. It's absolutely brilliant material. Last week we studied Jesus' invitation to love your enemy. How important is that? Love your enemy, and this week we follow the chapter which comes right behind it, based on this one. Cultivate a generous spirit. We see in both readings, the first reading and the gospel, both instances we have the perceived enemy. Why should I go to Israel for healing? I'm a Syrian, and you know how we feel about the Israelites. I'm a general in the army. The enemy. And then the gospel, of course, the Samaritan coming back. Samaritans despise Jews, and Jews despise Samaritans. The enemy. Could it be that the healing power is really in that teaching? Love your enemy. Could it be that the solution to many of my problems and many of my issues are precisely in that truth and that reality? Love your enemy. Most of us have grown up with the sense that we love our enemy because it's a noble thing to do. Amen? Yeah? That's not why Jesus is telling us to love our enemy. It's not for our enemy's sake, it's for my sake. See, what Jesus is teaching me is that it diminishes me greatly when I withhold love. When I enter into the experience of withholding love from the other, then I am choosing to be not like him. When I choose to withhold love, it disfigures me emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. I stand resistant with that unforgiveness in my heart while I cry out at the same time, Lord, be merciful to me. It causes me to become small in terms of my rationing of love when I despise my enemy. And when I choose to have enemies or name them enemies. When I become restricted or small in my rationing of love, I become less like him, whose love is expansive. He's inviting me to be more like him. When we cradle and nurture our hurt and our fear in the name of that enemy out there, we take ourselves out of the mainstream of his love and forgiveness. Because while I cry out to him, forgive me, Lord, I am withholding. And the central piece of the teaching on forgiveness is there's an RSVP attached to it. I will give you all the forgiveness you want and desire, but you got to let go of it and pass it to others. I interrupt that flow and that stream when I choose to be resistant. That's the teaching. Love your enemy, not for their sake, but because it disfigures you profoundly. Holding the grudges and being resistant. And then her next chapter is just brilliantly formed on that. Cultivate a generous spirit. You don't find generous people when they are withholding. It just doesn't happen. Linda Rooney speaks of the beneficiaries of a generous spirit. It benefits me because I'm now withholding and I'm becoming more like him. It benefits the other person, benefits them profoundly because they really begin to see what the core of the gospel is and what it really means to love my enemy. And it benefits God. It benefits God because we choose to become more like him when we resist that temptation. And it benefits the church ultimately because now we start practicing what we preach. There is a consistency in what we are saying and what we are doing. Linda Rooney just gives great insights into it. What a great teaching. She encourages the development of small faith communities. Wow. Isn't that a novel idea? Huh? Small faith communities, she says, where people intentionally support and challenge one another to greater discipleship. I can go to church every week, but nobody challenges me. I might hear some words and the Lord might speak to me some. But if I want to really grow my faith, then it's going to be gathering with smaller groups where we share and challenge and invite each other to significant growth, not peripheral growth. We challenge each other, she says, to greater discipleship. And as a result of sharing our faith and hope with others in a small group, we become buoyed up. We begin to look at, what does it mean? What are some of the nets that I need to leave behind? The very first chapter. What does it mean to live as a blessing? To know the blessing and to know the abundance of the Lord. My friends, we are doing precisely that. That is the reason that we began Christ Life 5 years ago, so that as a result of learning and studying and teaching as a group, then we might form small faith communities where people would more readily begin to engage the gospel and its invitation. That we would have people intentionally join small faith groups and really move into what it means to be a mature adult in faith. And additionally, that we would grow in a personal relationship with Him. That is the most important thing in the whole world. I could do, as Jesus said, I could accumulate and gather all sorts of things, but to what end if I don't know Him, the one true God and Jesus Christ whom He has sent? And so thank you. We are doing it. Your response in the small groups and your response to this great material, it's certainly blessing us abundantly. We are doing it, and hopefully we're really coming to understand what it means to love our enemies and why. And then cultivate an attitude of gratitude.